So, here I am. Can nuclear power be a part of a sustainable future? So why am I here talking about that? Marcus said something about it, and basically I've been working with energy research for like 15 years at Chalmers, at physical resource theory, and also quite recent, and I've been teaching about sustainable development during all this time, even though I haven't really been doing research about it. And then some years ago I wrote a textbook about sustainable development to understand this concept, because I was kind of annoyed how sustainable development was used very sloppily in the discussion. It more or less tend to mean something I like, and then that is sustainable. Or you talked, like we have here, sustainable in the meaning something that can go on forever. And that is not that interesting, is it? Because some things are sustainable, but doesn't lead to development and vice versa. So here's two examples. We have slavery, that has been very sustainable, in the sense, been around for a very long time, right? But it hasn't really led to any development. It hasn't developed people, it hasn't developed society. So even though it's sustainable in some sense, it goes on, it's not really good, right? Then we have this, those are Swedish, recognize the picture from Fucking Åmål, a Swedish movie. And this is young love, it's a picture of that. You know, that is not sustainable, you know that? But it leads to lots of development. So what sustainable development is about is to have a development that is sustained over time. And there are many good things, like young love, that is not really sustainable development, but it's still really important, right? And there are other things that are sustainable that we don't want. So how should we then understand sustainable development? Yeah, it's basically that we want to fulfill human needs today and into the future. And then, in order to do so, people have conceptualized this, that we need these three dimensions. And we'll talk more about this after me, and interesting to see if you say the same thing as I do, or you might not. But you basically need some prerequisites. You have the goal, is fulfilling human needs. And then you need some prerequisites, and that is basically a functioning ecological, economic, and social system. So like a foundation where you can build things. And then you have many different means, and to me, nuclear is a potential mean. It's a way of supplying energy or electricity to people. And some means might deteriorate the prerequisites. Some means might not lead to the goal. But since sustainable development has to do with what happens over time, it's important that we keep these prerequisites, because if we destroy them, they're typically very difficult to make it good again. So I just go briefly through how I understand these different dimensions. So the ecological dimension is basically to preserving a living environment that is necessary to sustain a human population. And there are basically two parts: a production capacity. Basically we have land that can produce things for us, and also ecosystem services. And then assimilation capacity, basically that nature can take care of some of our pollutants, like acidification or carbon dioxide. And of course, if we do destroy all agricultural land, we do not really have a prerequisites for agriculture, right? So in this sense, it's very important to have this ecological system that do work. The economic dimension has to do with efficient use and allocation of resources. And there are basically two parts there as well. One is extraction of non-renewable resources, metal, fossil fuels, phosphorus, and uranium as part of metals here. And basically, if we do extract and diffuse lots of material, future generations cannot use them for their purposes. Therefore, we kind of destroy or hamper their prerequisites for future generations. But of course, if you use metals and recycle them, not a big issue, right? Because then you keep them in the technosphere, in the societal system. Then we also have the capital stock, because we build infrastructure that also remains over many generations. And something that is very seldom discussed in this sense is human capital, our knowledge, to actually sustain knowledge over time. I think that is really important for future generations, that we do not lose knowledge over time. So this is what I would put in the economic dimension. Then we have the social one, and that is the messiest one, and people have different views of it, and this is how I have put it, or me and my co-authors. So it's basically building social institutions that help to provide human needs to be fulfilled. And roughly 3 parts here: distribution and control of power. It can be democracy, but other kind. We need some kind of governing system in all societies, and it takes long time to build those systems. And when they have destroyed them, I mean, to build a democratic society, for instance, where you have good feedback in the system, it takes very long time, and it can be fragile, as we have seen in different parts of the world. But I do think it's really important to fulfill human needs in the future. Create and sustain trust. That we have trust in society helps immensely for everything we do. In the Nordic country, we are, for some reason that no one really understands, we have a very high level of trust. We do trust people. And that makes business, politics, everything much easier. And again, this is something that takes a long time to build up, and if you destroy it, you really have to go back, and we don't really know actually how to build it again. The Nordic countries, for some historical reasons, made this, whereas other countries have very low levels of trust. And then you also need efficient and capable institutions. Basically, you have a bureaucracy that when the government say you should do A, they do A, and not something else. And it is, again, Nordic countries have a very, or Western world, a quite capable and efficient institution, but in many parts of the world, the government make a policy, but nothing really happens on the floor because there are corruptions or inefficiency in the system. And again, this takes very long time to build. So if you manage to build this social institution and preserve them, then future generation can discuss which technology or which agriculture they're going to have, but at least have a foundation that they can build something on. Because if they have a very bad institution, they won't be able to have either nuclear or wind power or whatever. So this is how I understand sustainable development. There are definitely other interpretations of it, but to me this is a way of separating goals, means, and prerequisites. So how do we view nuclear in this perspective then? Because I worked with energy, but actually I worked quite a lot with nuclear as well over the years. But I know some things better than others when it comes to nuclear. So if you start with accidents. So accidents, of course, is a problem. It's mainly a problem for the present generation. I mean, there are some spillover for future generations, but still. But it doesn't really deteriorate some of the prerequisites. It doesn't really destroy the whole foundation of society if you have an accident. But it's a serious incident still. Still, if you do look on body count compared to other technologies, basically how many are killed by kilowatt hour produced, nuclear is actually better than most other technologies. It's even better than solar PV. So how do people die from solar PV? Yeah, they fall down from the roofs. And there are actually quite a substantial amount of people that fall down from the roof when they apply social PVs. So then what's tricky with accidents when it comes to nuclear still is that even though not so many people have died in the past, of course more people could have died. And secondly, there are the sense of fear when it comes to nuclear power is much higher than other technologies. People are more afraid of radiation than they are from, just gas or whatever thing that is a hazard for people. So that creates additional problems. But to me, this is not like to say you can have accidents, therefore it's not consistent with sustainable development. It's something we have to deal with, but it's not a deal breaker. You have the waste. That, of course, is a potential threat to future generations. Here, I guess there are experts that are much better than me in the waste management. But when I have tried to look into this, to me, there might be hazards for future generations, but the level of that hazard is quite minor still compared to all the different hazards we do expose people to. And, I mean, we need to always do some kind of trade-off, right? I mean, we allow cars even though people are killed by cars. So we have to make this cost-benefit kind of analysis for all technologies we do allow in our society. But it's something to be careful about, but to me it's more like a technical problem actually. We have the resource base, going back to the economic dimension. And it's limited, but still it's really large. The presence of uranium is huge. Then, of course, the concentration is kind of low in some places. But there are this research that you can extract uranium from the seawater, and then the potential is really huge. And then, of course, you have the fourth generation kind of reactors where you reuse the fuel or create plutonium. So basically, I would say that at least for transient, then how long this transient period would be depends on which technology that you use. If you use breeder reactors, it might be, I don't know, 1,000 years. If you have only light water reactors, maybe on the order of a few hundred years. But I do think it makes sense that we do use resources. We shouldn't use them all. We should save some for future generations, but still for a period while we might develop something that do not rely on as scarce resources. So I think, again, this is something to consider, but it's not like to say, hey, nuclear power uses a resource base, then it's unsustainable, because then basically also, yeah, this computer would be unsustainable in the same sense, unless you recycle it fully. And then we have the nuclear proliferation issue. And again, this is not that important for whether Sweden should build or not build or close one reactor. But if you're going to use nuclear power to really solve the climate issue, then we need an upscaling on the order of, yeah, factor of 10 or 100 when it comes to nuclear reactors. And then the possibility and knowledge to gain nuclear weapons for many countries of the world will increase probably. And this, of course, if there will be nuclear proliferation and a nuclear war, that is, of course, a huge effect on both present and future generations. So it's a huge thing. Then I think you cannot probably attribute that only to civil nuclear power, because the other things play as well. And what I think is important here as well is how important this is depends on the social dimension. If we have a quite stable world with high level of trust, then it's probably less of a problem that many countries do have access to enrichment and so on. But if we have a hostile world with lots of tension, then of course that imposes a larger risk in the system. So here it's more, and also probably, as we see with Iran, that access to enrichment facilities actually also creates tension in the political system. So I would actually say this one is maybe the one that you mainly should discuss when it comes to the concept of sustainable development, actually, and nuclear. And again, it's mainly important if we talk about real upscaling, not a reactor here and there. Okay. Yeah, here are the casualties. Could be, if you haven't seen this one, but here we have the number of deaths due to accidents and pollutants. And for different, there's coal in the developing world, in the industrial world, oil, biomass, natural gas, and it's not zero here, as you know, but and it's per gigawatt year, so it's very low. And here, when it's come to hydro, we had some disasters. It was quite a long time ago now, where we had dams that collapsed, and several hundred people, 100,000 people died. And here we have people falling off the roofs. Okay, so then the one question remains, of course, is it like cost effective to have nuclear power? And this has been discussed a lot, and there came a study quite recently by Hong and Quist, where they say, okay, this is a system we have today in Sweden. We have hydropower, we have some CHP, some nuclear, and some wind and solar. And then they said, if you're going to take away the nuclear here, and we have a dry year, we need to install this amount of wind power. And that will make the system like 6 times as expensive. So taking away nuclear power from the Swedish system will increase the cost immensely. And they have, of course, when you do this kind of modeling studies, you have some assumptions. And they say that the total trade as they are today, wind and solar have to replace the nuclear production. So basically, you take away the nuclear, and they say, wind and solar do the same thing as nuclear. And they didn't have any battery storage or demand response in the system. And they didn't really optimize the full system. They only optimized the solar and wind. So we saw this and say, hey, this looks strange. And there are other pieces in literature where it says that the cost is not like that. So we say, okay, let's redo it as we think is reasonable. So we build another model where you basically divide it. And I think here it's important, often when you do this kind of look at Sweden, you only look at Sweden in isolation. But you can't really do that because trade is important. And if you're going to take away nuclear and replace it with renewables, trade will be even more important. So you cannot treat trade as something we don't really care about. You need to treat that seriously. So basically, we put regions, and then they are connected as they are today with transmission lines. And we say, okay, let's see if we build a system with nuclear in Sweden or without nuclear. Whereas at the same time, the rest of Europe keeps the nuclear they have, but for the rest part, go renewable. So basically, we model kind of 2050, whole Europe goes renewable. And we have a emission constraint of 10 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which basically is very, very low. I mean, a coal-fired power plant is 1,000 here. So it's 1% of a coal-fired power plant, that should be the average. And we also included like storage and demand response. We did model a dry year, as the Hong paper did as well, so we could compare. And then we see, okay, what happens if we do it like this? And then we instead, rather than this, what we found was that, you have to replace the nuclear, but you can do that basically by a bit of solar and a bit of wind, and that's pretty much it. And we got a cost of roughly 60 euro per megawatt hour compared to their of 300. And then you wonder here, okay, but hey, if you have so much wind and solar, what happens in these winter days when there are no wind, right? Some are thinking about that, yeah. So this is how it might look like. So here we have the hydropower, and here we have the wind power. So here are very little wind in the Swedish system. And then you run the hydropower at max capacity, more or less. You have some CHP. You also have some biogas. You do get some solar, because, I mean, still here we have a lot of installation of both solar and wind. So even though it's not very windy, you get some wind. But what then is important is that you trade in. You actually trade out a little bit as well, but like bluish up there is trade. You also have the purple is some demand response, where you reduce demand in some industries during these peak periods, where the prices are really high. What is important here, the trade we have here, is not some trade we made up. We actually modeled the whole Europe. So there are surplus wind or solar somewhere in Europe that we, with losses, of course, and costs, can transport to the Nordic system. So it actually, and this kind of surprised me when I did this, because before I haven't modeled this kind of hour-by-hour modeling, but it's actually, there are usually some wind or some solar somewhere in Europe all the time that you can distribute. You have to wait a little bit, I think. But I'm soon ready. So, and then we looked more carefully as well and say, okay, but if you allow for nuclear, if you allow to build nuclear, how much cheaper would it be compared to not allowing for nuclear? So, I mean, basically, that is a policy discussion we have in Sweden. Okay, we have the issue about keeping the reactors, and we don't look at that. And I do think that's probably makes sense in many cases if they are like in good shape enough to keep the nuclear reactor. But it's more like, should we build new ones? So we basically compared a system where we are allowed to build new ones, or you're not allowed to build new ones, and you have to rely on the renewables. And then, of course, we don't know anything about the future, so we'd have to be varied, that the transmission cost might be high or low, the storage cost might vary, but also we don't know, and that you know are inherently difficult to estimate, how much will a nuclear power plant cost in 10 years. But what we found here is that if the nuclear cost was what we call medium to high, medium here is like 4,500 euro per kilowatt, which is not like extremely high or low, so it's come in the middle. It's actually not cost effective to build any nuclear at all. So it's cheaper to rely solely on solar and wind and storage and so on. If the nuclear cost becomes low, and here low we mean about 3,700 euro per kilowatt hour per kilowatt installed capacity, which probably we might reach if you start to mass produce nuclear power again. Then there is a small cost difference. They are invested in some nuclear power in Sweden, but the difference of not doing it is like fraction of a percentage. So there doesn't actually seem to be a strong economic advantages to reinstall nuclear power in Sweden, if you do consider the whole system. So I will round off there. So what I would like to say is that sustainable development needs to be understood as something more precise than just what I think is good or what can go on forever. So we need to be a bit more careful when we talk about sustainable development than that. I would say that nuclear could be consistent, at least for a transient period with sustainable development. So I don't think it's a technology you should rule out. I do think it makes sense to actually put research money into it. But at least for the Swedish case, there seems to be very limited economic rationale for investing in new nuclear power plants in Sweden, even if we look for a decarbonized renewable system. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Fredrik, and I'm going to let Daniel very soon.
First.
So, but I'm first because
yeah,
I'm.
You're first, okay.
Yeah, I'm taking that that role. So just before we kind of dive into the detail, do you think that we kind of look at sustainable development differently in relation to nuclear compared to other technologies? For instance, I think the graph that you show with accidents, I think that kind of goes against what many people have intuitively thought about nuclear. Yeah. And do you think the sort of that aspect of how we view sustainable development should be kind of tweaked or refocused in relation to nuclear?
No, I don't know about the view of sustainable development, but I do think, and I think this is tricky. Okay, nuclear power has a worse reputation than it deserves, I think. People are more afraid of radiation than they are afraid of other things. Is that what you're getting at? And they think a lot of people have died of nuclear accidents, but they haven't. But still, the problem is you can never understand a technology outside the social context. So since people behave like this and think like this for whatever reason, that is like part of the cost of nuclear, that people are afraid and they want more kind of security and so on that might be rational or whatever you would call it, and that you have to count in. So therefore I think perception matters. But I don't know if the perception of sustainable development is important, but the perception of technology should be allocated to the technology. Was that roughly an answer?
Yeah. So I think you have little microphones on the side of your chair, I think.
Advanced.
And I guess there's a little button you can push. So please state your name and a question, starting up here with.
Hi, I'm Adam Kanne from Uniper. I have a question related to the assumptions regarding interconnectivity and so on. Is it, I mean, your model basically connecting all Europe, is that based on the current interconnectivity today? Yes. What is transferable?
So what I showed here is with the present transmission. Yeah. And then we also in the paper have when we allow for, I mean, there are lines here and we have the capacity is as they are today.
As of today.
Yeah. And then we also run, and what's actually interesting that if you allow for transmission capacity to expand, you actually, it becomes more interesting to invest in nuclear in Sweden. And I can explain why, but I mean, it's more, but I know people are often quite hesitant to say, okay, can we really build, if you make these really renewable scenarios, you often have lots of transmission and people are suspicious about it's really possible, but actually even without that, it's still possible.
Thanks. Daniel, I think, was first, right?
Daniel Westlén. I was curious about your assumption that it's always windy or sunny somewhere in Europe. When you look at production data for wind and solar for the European continent, you rather see the opposite. There are quite long periods when it's not windy nor sunny. So what's the basis for that assumption?
Yeah, so the basis for that, and I think it's an important distinction, is that we use weather data for the whole Europe. And then the model can choose to where should I build wind parks. Because now you have built wind parks in some part of Europe but not other ones. And then if you look at production data, that is the production data you see. But here, for instance, it makes sense sometimes to build wind parks in less windy places, less good places, because they do produce in other times. And that is the kind of benefit of this kind of global optimization, that you capture that you do not if you look at production data. So we use real weather data, and there are other people that have used weather data for many different years and so on. I just picked 1 year. But it doesn't seem to actually matter so much which year you use.
I think you were first, yeah.
Good morning. My name is Marcus Eriksson from Vattenfall. Thank you very much for this interesting topic. I have a question on the economic assumptions that you made, comparing those graphs on...
This one-ish?
Right, yeah. We can look at that one. If you build a new nuclear power plant today, it's as a life of 60 or 80 years.
Yeah.
A new wind plant have a life of perhaps 20 years. Yeah, so you will have to replace that windmills 3 or 4 times. Yeah. Did you take that into account?
Yeah, I mean, when we calculate the cost, I mean, there are basically 2 factors that are important. One is the discount rate, and the other one is the lifetime it has. Then, so we only optimize for 1 year due to computational reasons, but like the cost of wind becomes higher since the life length is shorter. But actually, since the discount rate is 5%, as we use here, it is not that important as you might imagine, actually. So it doesn't have that huge impact of the cost because the discount rate tend to be more important. But we have, I don't think we have 80 years, I think we have 60 years for the nuclear power plant. But again, I don't think that would make a huge difference here.
All right, thanks. So I think we're going to have to save the... I know there are more questions for the panel or for the coffee break. So thanks a lot, Fredrik. And yeah, give us another hand, yeah.